Here is something that military historians still find difficult to fully process, even more than 80 years after it happened. An entire army, one of the largest, most heavily armed military forces on the face of the earth, deployed counter-snipers, artillery bombardments, and coordinated search operations against a single man. Not a general, not a commander, not someone coordinating thousands of troops, a farmer. A 34-year-old farmer from rural Finland who stood just over 5 feet tall and, by the time the Soviet army finally managed to put him out of action, had killed more soldiers in a shorter period than any sniper in the recorded history of warfare. His name was Simo Häyhä, and what the Red Army did to try to stop him tells us as much about the nature of fear in wartime as it does about the skill of one extraordinary marksman. This is the full story. The man before the myth. To understand what made Simo Häyhä so dangerous, you have to understand where he came from and what kind of life had quietly prepared him for war without him ever knowing it. He was born on December 17, 1905, in the rural municipality of Rautjärvi in southern Finland, just a short distance from the Russian border. He was the 7th of 8 children raised in a Lutheran farming family. His father ran the Mattila farm. His mother, by all accounts, worked from before dawn until after dark. It was the kind of upbringing that built patience, endurance, and a relationship with the outdoors that most people in cities simply never develop. From childhood, Häyhä spent his free hours in the dense Finnish forests, hunting small game with a bolt-action rifle. This was not a hobby in the casual sense. This was survival culture. The winters in that part of Finland are brutal and long, and learning to read the land, where animals moved, how snow behaved underfoot, how light shifted through birch trees at dusk, it was simply part of growing up. At 17, he joined the Suojeluskunta, Finland's volunteer civil guard, a paramilitary organization that dated back to the country's declaration of independence in 1917. Here, his natural skill with a rifle became formalized. He began entering shooting competitions across the Viipuri province, and he won so consistently that by the time he was a young adult, his farmhouse was reportedly filled with trophies. According to Major Tapio Saarelainen, who wrote Häyhä's biography and interviewed him dozens of times before his death, Häyhä could estimate distances with an accuracy of 1 meter up to 150 meters away. He could hit a small target 16 times in under a minute from that same distance using a bolt-action rifle, meaning he was manually cycling the action, reloading, and reacquiring his aim between each shot at a speed that stretched the boundaries of what most people would consider physically possible. He completed his required year of military service at age 20, was promoted to corporal, and then returned quietly to farming. He skied, he hunted, he competed, he stayed close to the land. No one, looking at him then, would have predicted what was coming. He was known in his community as modest, quiet, and unpretentious. A man who would stand at the back of group photographs rather than position himself front and center. A man who let his shooting speak for him and said very little else. All of that changed on November 30th, 1939. A giant steps into Finland. To understand what Häyhä walked into when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, you need to understand how catastrophically overconfident the Soviets were, and why. Joseph Stalin had spent the late 1930s methodically dismantling his own military's leadership in the purges that history knows as the Great Purge. Between 1937 and 1939, 3 out of 5 Soviet marshals were executed. Approximately 35,000 officers were either killed, imprisoned, or dismissed from service. The experienced military minds who understood logistics, tactics, and winter warfare were replaced with politically reliable but militarily inexperienced figures who were far more afraid of disobeying Stalin than they were of making catastrophic battlefield errors. The result was a Red Army that had enormous numbers of men and weapons, but was led in many cases by people who had been promoted far beyond their competence and who were operating in an atmosphere of fear that punished independent thinking. Commanders who reported bad news faced accusations of defeatism. Commanders who adapted to reality rather than following orders faced worse. Into this environment, Stalin's Soviet Union turned its eye toward Finland. The logic on paper was sound. Finland had a population of around 4 million people. The Soviet Union had 150 million. Finland's military numbered somewhere around 300,000 at mobilization. The Soviets sent over 450,000 troops across the border on the opening day, eventually committing close to 1 million men to the campaign. They had vastly superior numbers of tanks and aircraft. The Finnish Air Force had a little over 100 planes. Stalin expected this to be over in 2 weeks. He was spectacularly wrong. What Soviet planners had not adequately accounted for was the terrain, the temperature, the Finnish doctrine of mobile winter warfare, and the fundamental fact that the Finnish soldiers were fighting for their homes. The forests of Karelia and the regions around Lake Ladoga were dense, road-bound, and utterly unsuited to the kind of mechanized advance the Soviets favored. Many Soviet troops had no skis and no idea how to use them. Temperatures plunged to negative 40 degrees Celsius, and even colder, for days at a time. Soviet soldiers were, in many instances, not issued proper winter camouflage, which meant they moved through a landscape of blinding white in dark uniforms, visible to anyone watching from the tree line. And someone was always watching from the tree line. The ghost of Simo Häyhä reported for duty and was assigned to the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, deployed to the Battle of Kola, a grinding, brutal defensive engagement in Ladoga, Karelia, where Finnish forces were outnumbered at points by ratios of 10-1 or worse. The Kola River became the line that had to hold, and the phrase Kola Kesta, Kola holds, became a national rallying cry. Estimates suggest the Red Army was firing as many as 40,000 artillery rounds per day at Finnish positions in this sector, while the Finns could reply with roughly 1,000. Into this landscape of overwhelming pressure, Häyhä settled into his work. His method was built on a philosophy of total concealment. He would rise before dawn and move into position before the light came, often spending the entire day in the same spot without moving significantly. His uniform was entirely white, blending seamlessly with the snow-covered ground. Beneath that, he wore multiple layers of clothing and carried sugar and bread in his pockets for calories to sustain his body heat. He chose to use the iron sights on his Finnish M2830 rifle, a variant of the Russian Mosin Nagant, rather than a telescopic scope. This was not stubbornness or tradition. It was deliberate and practical. A telescopic scope requires the shooter to raise their head higher above the snow line, increasing their visible profile. A scope lens could fog or freeze in temperatures that severe, and most crucially, a glass lens could catch and reflect sunlight, flashing a signal to anyone watching the distant wood line. There is a sniper there. Without a scope, Häyhä could press himself almost flat against the snow, his entire body almost invisible, just his eyes and the barrel of his rifle exposed. He packed dense mounds of snow in front of his position to cushion his rifle, reduce the small puff of displaced snow that a muzzle blast creates, and break up his outline against the ground. He kept snow in his mouth while he waited so that his breath would not produce the telltale cloud of vapor that freezing air creates around warm exhalations. In those temperatures, that small white cloud above a sniper's mouth could be spotted from hundreds of meters away. He targeted Soviet officers first, then machine gun operators, then senior NCOs, the people whose loss would disrupt coordination and momentum in an advancing unit. He was calculating in ways that went well beyond simply pulling a trigger. The confirmed kill tallies kept by Finnish military record keepers show the pace accelerating with frightening speed. Within the first 22 days of the war, he had 138 confirmed kills. By January 26, 1940, the number had climbed to 199. By February 17th, it was 219. In the 18 days that followed that count, he killed another 40 Soviet soldiers. And those are the confirmed figures. verified by his comrades, counted only when the fallen were definitively confirmed dead and when Häyhä was the sole shooter in that engagement. His highest single-day count, recorded on December 21st, 1939, was 25 confirmed kills in a day when daylight lasted only a few hours. 5 kills per day, on average, during a winter that almost no living human being would voluntarily spend outdoors. Fear spreads through the Red Army. The psychological effect of what Häyhä was doing cannot be separated from the tactical effect. These are two sides of the same coin, and the Soviets experienced both simultaneously. At first, commanders at the front dismissed reports of heavy losses to sniper fire as exaggerated or poorly reported. Snipers existed. Every army had them. You adjusted, you moved differently, you kept your head down, but the losses kept coming. Patrols would enter the Kalaya forest and return missing men, silently, with no shots heard by those at the rear. Officers would fall while attempting to organize their soldiers along the narrow forest roads with no muzzle flash visible, no crack of a distant rifle, cutting through the frozen air at the right angle to locate the shooter. Supply line workers became targets. Machine gun crews were eliminated with what seemed like surgical regularity. Unit cohesion began to fray as the invisible threat metastasized from a tactical problem into a psychological one. Soviet soldiers began refusing to move during daylight hours. This was not cowardice in the conventional sense. It was a rational response to a situation where any movement in exposed ground carried what felt like a mortal probability. The forests felt alive in a way that was deeply unnatural to men who had come expecting a straightforward, if cold, military campaign. You could not see what was killing you. You could not predict it. You could not hear it coming. The name that began circulating among Soviet troops, Belaya Smert, the White Death, captured this atmosphere of supernatural dread. Whether the name originated organically among Soviet frontline soldiers, or was partly amplified by Finnish propaganda, and historians note that Finnish newspapers were enthusiastically building the myth of Häyhä at home simultaneously, almost doesn't matter for the purposes of understanding its effect. The fear was real. The paralysis was real. The whispers were real. Some historians have noted that the psychological impact of Häyhä and the other Finnish snipers at Kola was arguably as important as the physical losses they inflicted. When soldiers stop moving because they are afraid of an invisible enemy, an entire offensive grinds to a halt. When officers stop rallying their men because officers die when they do so, command structures collapse. The Soviets, already hampered by poor leadership at the top, as a consequence of the purges, were having that leadership problem compounded at every level of the front by the presence of Finnish marksmen who specifically targeted the people with authority to make decisions. The hunt. An army turns its sights on one man. The Soviet response, when it came, was not subtle. It was layered, escalating, and ultimately representative of an army growing increasingly desperate. The first move was to send in counter-snipers. This was standard military doctrine. You locate an enemy sniper, you assign your best marksman to hunt, and neutralize them. The Soviets had competent snipers. They had actually been developing a sniper corps since 1928, so they had trained personnel to deploy. One account that has circulated in multiple historical sources tells the story of a skilled Soviet sniper who was dispatched specifically to hunt Häyhä down. This Soviet marksman worked methodically. He killed several Finnish soldiers and 3 Finnish officers, demonstrating genuine skill and patience, and then settled in to wait for Häyhä to reveal himself. The logic was sound. Häyhä was known to be active in the sector. If you killed enough people, he would eventually respond. And when he did, you would see the flash or detect some movement, and you would take your shot. He waited through the daylight hours. Nothing. As the sun began to drop toward the tree line, the Soviet sniper, having lost the light and seeing no opportunity remaining, rose to his knees to move from his position. The glint of the dying sunlight caught on the glass of his telescopic scope. Häyhä had been watching the same ground for hours. He put a single bullet through the Soviet sniper's head from 450 meters, using his iron sights. This was not the only attempt. Counter-snipers kept coming. They did not come back, and so the Soviets escalated. Artillery, iron shields, and the shelling of forests. When counter-snipers proved ineffective, Soviet commanders turned to the bluntest instrument available: indirect fire. Artillery and mortar crews began pounding forest sections, where Häyhä was suspected to be operating based on kill patterns, unit reports, and geographic analysis of likely firing positions. The scale of this response is worth sitting with for a moment. The Soviets were expending enormous quantities of artillery ammunition in a war where they were already firing tens of thousands of rounds per day at Finnish defensive lines, in an attempt to saturate forested areas with enough explosives to kill one man whose location they could not pinpoint. The shells landed on trees. They landed on frozen ground. They threw snow and splinters and shrapnel across wide areas. It was, as one military analysis put it, massively ineffective. Häyhä moved constantly between engagements, never staying in one position long. His habit of choosing natural concealment positions meant the ground itself was absorbing much of the damage. One historical account notes that he survived an artillery strike with nothing but a minor scratch on his back and damage to his coat, and then kept working. The desperation showed itself in other ways too. According to sources from the period, Soviet troops in the Kola sector began bringing heavy iron shields into the field. Portable metal protection they could position themselves behind to guard against sniper fire. The story that accompanied the shields is one of those details that, true or embellished, perfectly captures the absurdity of the situation. Finnish snipers, including Häyhä, were accurate enough that when Soviet soldiers sheltered behind their shields, the Finns simply shot them in the kneecaps. The one part of the body the shields did not protect. Beyond the counter-snipers and the artillery, search teams were deployed. Dogs were brought in. Scouts were sent ahead of advancing units specifically tasked with locating and identifying Häyhä's firing positions after each engagement. These efforts repeatedly came up empty. Häyhä's discipline was extreme. He would sometimes spend the entire day without firing at all if he judged that the risk of detection was higher than the opportunity was worth. He was not simply a killing machine. He was a hunter, with a hunter's instinct for when to engage and when to remain invisible. By the time February turned into March 1940, the Soviets were mounting their heaviest push yet against Kola. They were learning from their earlier mistakes, improving their command structure under pressure, and throwing more firepower at Finnish lines than at any previous point in the war. The Finnish position was increasingly difficult to sustain, and Simo Häyhä, now officially proclaimed a hero of Finland by his government, on February 17th and gifted a custom-made honorary Seiko M/28-30 rifle by a Swedish businessman, was still in the field and still killing. March 6th, 1940. The day he finally fell. By the first week of March 1940, the Winter War was grinding toward its conclusion, though the soldiers on the ground did not yet know it. The Soviet offensive was intensifying. Häyhä, now fighting both in his sniper role and as a squad leader alongside regular infantry, was engaged with a Soviet force that substantially outnumbered his group. The day of March 6th was, by the account of Finnish military records, one of Häyhä's most active days. He had accumulated approximately 40 confirmed kills for the day alone by midday, an almost incomprehensible rate of fire for a man working alone with a bolt-action rifle. And then his luck, which had held through temperatures of -40 degrees, through counter-sniper ambushes, through artillery barrages, through months of the most intensive personal hunting any army had organized against a single soldier, finally ran out. A Soviet soldier spotted him. The shot that connected with Simo Häyhä was fired at close range and used an explosive bullet, a round designed to detonate on impact and maximize tissue damage. It struck him in the lower left jaw. The bullet shattered bone, destroyed much of his lower face, and blew away part of his left cheek. He collapsed into the snow, unconscious. Finnish soldiers found him and assumed initially that he was dead. He was placed among the fallen for transport to the rear. According to accounts from the men who found him, the visible damage to his face was so severe that what remained was barely recognizable. It was only when one soldier noticed that his leg was moving, the faintest involuntary twitch in an otherwise apparently lifeless body, that they realized he was alive. They loaded him onto a sled and rushed him to a field hospital. The Soviet propaganda machine, upon hearing that the White Death had been shot, declared him dead and spread the news as a propaganda victory. Finnish newspapers reported his death as well. He lay in a coma for 11 days. He woke up on March 13th, 1940. It was the same day the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed, ending the Winter War. He learned of his own reported death by reading about it in a newspaper. Then he wrote a letter to the paper to correct the misunderstanding. What the Soviets paid and what the world noticed. The Moscow Peace Treaty gave the Soviet Union what it had originally demanded, a substantial strip of Finnish territory, representing about 11% of Finland's pre-war land, including the economically important Karelian Isthmus. On paper, this was a Soviet victory. They had eventually broken Finnish resistance and extracted the territorial concessions they wanted. But the cost was staggering in ways that reverberated far beyond Finland. Finnish casualties across the entire Winter War totaled approximately 25,000 killed. Soviet losses, by scholarly consensus, were somewhere between 130,000 and 170,000 killed, with total casualties, dead, wounded, and prisoners, possibly exceeding 350,000. Some estimates run higher. The international press at the time reported that no other campaign had damaged the Red Army's reputation so badly in the eyes of the world. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union for the illegal invasion. The image of the Soviets as an unstoppable military juggernaut, the image Stalin had been carefully projecting, was replaced by something far more damaging, an image of incompetence. In the aftermath, Stalin himself was furious. A famous account from Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev describes a meeting where Khrushchev's colleague Voroshilov was confronted by Stalin over the military's catastrophic failures. Voroshilov, in a rare moment of defiance, shouted back that Stalin had himself to blame, that the best generals had been killed in the purges. He then picked up a plate of roasted pig and hurled it against the table. The exchange captures the atmosphere inside Soviet command perfectly. Because of the Finnish fiasco, Stalin eventually rehabilitated and restored approximately 13,000 military officers to their positions, a tacit admission that the purges had gutted the very expertise the army desperately needed. And then there were the snipers. The encounters at Kola, and with Häyhä specifically, forced a serious reassessment of Soviet sniper doctrine. The Red Army had been building a sniper corps since 1928, but the Winter War demonstrated just how far behind Finnish marksmen they truly were. After the war, Soviet military planners significantly expanded sniper training programs, developed new rifles, notably the accurized Mosin Nagant 91/30 fitted with PE and PEM scopes, and began producing snipers in earnest. It was legions of these Red Army snipers trained in the wake of the Winter War's hard lessons who would later play a decisive role in the defense against the German invasion at Stalingrad, at Leningrad, at Kursk. There is one more consequence worth examining because it connects directly to the larger arc of the Second World War. Historians have noted, and some historians have argued quite compellingly, that the Winter War's demonstration of Soviet military weakness contributed directly to Adolf Hitler's decision to launch Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, in June 1941. Hitler and his advisors watched the Red Army struggle for months to defeat a country of 4 million people with a fraction of their equipment and manpower. They concluded, not unreasonably based on the evidence available to them, that the Soviet military was a hollow structure that would collapse under the kind of rapid blitzkrieg assault Germany had used to overrun France in 6 weeks. They were wrong. But the Winter War planted that seed of miscalculation, and it bore terrible fruit for Germany when Soviet resistance proved far more resilient than anyone expecting a repeat of Finland had anticipated. After the guns went silent, Simo Häyhä survived his wounds. though the healing process was long and painful. He underwent 26 surgeries over 14 months in hospital. His lower jaw was rebuilt. His face remained visibly scarred for the rest of his life. The damage permanent enough that photographs of him after the war show a face altered in ways that serve as a quiet reminder of how close things had come. Shortly after the war, on August 28, 1940, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, the legendary commander of the Finnish defense, personally promoted Häyhä from the lowest rank of non-commissioned officer directly to the rank of second lieutenant in a single step. No one in Finnish military history had ever risen through the ranks so rapidly. It was Mannerheim's way of saying, in the formal language of military hierarchy, that what this man had done was categorically without precedent. When the Continuation War broke out in 1941, Finland's second conflict against the Soviet Union, fought this time alongside Germany following the German invasion, Häyhä requested permission to return to the front. The military refused. His injuries were still too severe. He spent that war at home. In the decades that followed, he lived quietly in the Finnish countryside. He was given a farm in Ruokolahti in southeastern Finland, close to the Russian border, and he bred dogs and hunted moose. He became a respected hunting partner of Finnish President Urho Kekkonen, a detail that perhaps captures better than anything else the particular way Finland held him. Not as a celebrated hero who sought the spotlight, but as a man of the forests who happened to have done something extraordinary in them. He rarely spoke about the war. When journalists sought him out in his later years, he answered their questions with the same economy of words he had apparently always possessed. When asked in 1998 how he had become such a skilled sniper, he gave an answer that has been quoted hundreds of times since, and that never stops feeling both completely honest and somehow larger than itself. "Practice," he said. When asked years later whether he felt remorse for killing so many people, he paused and then replied, with equal simplicity, "I did what I was told, as well as I could. There would be no Finland unless everyone had done the same." He died on April 1st, 2002, at the age of 96, in a veterans' nursing home in Hamina, Finland. His private war memoir, a document he had written in 1940, just months after being wounded, was discovered in 2017, hidden and unknown for decades. In it, he recorded his own estimated total as approximately 500 kills. He called it, in Finnish, his sin list. The larger story, what the Soviet Army did to stop Simo Häyhä, was in the end a reflection of something more than just military strategy. It was a reflection of what happens when an institution built on bureaucratic certainty encounters something it cannot fully categorize or control. The Red Army had playbooks for armies. It had playbooks for fortifications, for defensive lines, for artillery emplacements. It did not have a fully functional playbook for a single man in the snow who moved like part of the landscape and killed with the patient precision of a hunter, because at his core, that is exactly what he was. The counter-snipers they sent were skilled men who died because their training had not fully reckoned with the possibility that the man they were hunting might be better than them in every way that mattered in that specific environment. The artillery they lobbed into the Karelian forests cost enormous quantities of shells and accomplished little because the target was never in the same place long enough to be caught by blast radius. The search teams found nothing because Häyhä understood the forest in ways that a man born near Leningrad and assigned to Finland on 2 weeks' notice simply could not. In the end, what stopped Simo Häyhä was not superior tactics or superior training. It was a single soldier who happened to spot him on a day when, after over 100 days of impossible kills and impossible survival, his luck momentarily failed. An explosive bullet, at close range, half a face, 11 days of coma, and he still woke up. The story of the White Death is sometimes told as the story of one man's extraordinary skill, and that is true as far as it goes. But it is equally the story of what determined resistance looks like when it is forced to face overwhelming force, and the story of the gap between institutional power and individual human capability when the terrain and the conditions favor the individual. 500 soldiers, less than 100 days. An entire army that changed its tactics, fired thousands of artillery shells, deployed its best marksmen, and still could not find him until he let his guard down for a single fatal moment on the last week of a war that was already ending. That is the story of Simo Häyhä, and it will not stop being remarkable. If this story stayed with you, and I think it will, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment below. Do you think the Winter War changed the course of the entire Second World War? Because a strong argument can be made that it did. I'd love to hear your thoughts.